is looking to fundamentally restructure the international trading system. And just yesterday, he announced a pause on what is called a global set of reciprocal tariffs for all countries but China.
This isn't just another trade headline. You're watching an entire system seize up in real time. One midnight announcement, one supply line cut, and within hours, factories idle, prices spike, leaders scrambling behind closed doors. If you drive a car, depend on a paycheck, or care where this economy is headed, what happens next will hit closer than you think. Most people won't see it until it shows up in their driveway or on their pay stub. By then, it'll be too late to react. Why did Canada pull the plug? How fast will the damage spread? And, most importantly, how will it hit you? What's happening? It started with a single midnight press release, quietly posted, quickly viral. Canada's government announced the immediate suspension of all steel exports to the United States. No negotiation, no buffer period, no explanation beyond a vague reference to sovereign trade enforcement. Within 30 minutes, commodity traders froze transactions. Within 1 hour, North American steel futures spiked more than 20%. By sunrise, the headlines were unanimous. The lifeblood of U.S. manufacturing had just been shut off at the source. Steel isn't just a commodity. It is the skeleton of every U.S. vehicle rolling off the line. From the frame to the door panels, from brake calipers to battery housings, it runs through the industry like blood in veins. And with Canada responsible for nearly 1/4 of the American steel supply, the decision wasn't symbolic. It was surgical. Inside boardrooms, executives scrambled. Do we have inventory? How long until this hits production? Where can we source steel overnight? The answers came fast, and they weren't good. There was no redundancy, no reserve stockpile, no backup system for a relationship that had never been questioned. This wasn't just a supply disruption. It was a supply assassination, an economic kill shot delivered without warning, without precedent. Steel didn't just disappear. It left a silence that echoed through every factory wall. Shift canceled indefinitely. At a stamping plant outside Toledo, Ohio, the second shift never clocked in. Around 3:30 in the afternoon, phones started buzzing. A simple text from the line supervisor: shift canceled. Await update. Forklifts were already half-loaded. Workers had their gear on. Engines were mid-assembly, but nothing moved. The steel delivery from Hamilton, Ontario, had been rerouted. No one knew where it went. The production line went silent. Jason Melendez, a 27-year-old welder on the frame team, stood at the factory gate staring at the cancellation message. "We've never missed a day," he said to no one in particular. Not even during COVID. Around him, others just nodded. There were no riots, no shouting, just the sound of steel boots on gravel as shift workers walked back to their cars in silence. The plant had been running at full tilt to meet quarterly targets. Now, dozens of partially assembled vehicles sat stranded mid-process. No steel meant no shells. No shells meant no production. No production meant no paychecks. This wasn't a protest. It was paralysis, not from regulators or rioters, but from reality itself. The thing about modern supply chains is they don't bend, they break. And once broken, the damage isn't visible until it's far too late. While boots left the factory floor, the boardroom started to tremble. If you're watching this unfold and thinking, why isn't anyone talking about this? You're not alone. Hit the like button so this reaches more people. Drop a comment below. Do you think this was a warning shot or a full-blown strike? Stranded in America. Inside a Detroit boardroom, the mood had turned acidic. Executives at Ford, Stellantis, and GM weren't debating damage control. They were trying to understand how it had all fallen apart so fast. "We build 80% of our vehicles right here," one VP snapped. "How the hell are we this exposed?" The answer was on the wall, a procurement map linking nearly 60% of Ford's structural steel inputs to Canadian mills. The irony was thick. For years, Made in America had been a branding triumph, a patriotic flex, but under the hood, it depended on foreign raw material flowing uninterrupted across borders. Economic nationalism, it turned out, didn't protect against economic dependency. The export freeze had arrived without context, but its timing was damning. It came just weeks after new U.S. tariffs had hit Canadian industrial metals. And now, with the steel tap turned off, the rhetoric of self-sufficiency had been exposed as hollow. There were no U.S.-based suppliers ready to fill the gap. Not in 2 weeks, not in 2 months. Calls were placed, emergency sourcing teams were activated, legal counsels reviewed cross-border contracts. But the math didn't care. No steel meant no cars, and no cars meant no revenue. The executives weren't looking at a disruption. They were looking at a collapse. Thousands of miles away, across cold cabinet tables in Ottawa. A plan was already unfolding. Carney's checkmate. The decision wasn't made in anger. It wasn't a knee-jerk reaction or a political stunt. Inside the cabinet chambers in Ottawa, Prime Minister Mark Carney sat calmly as his trade minister laid out the final export freeze order. "They imposed tariffs without warning," she said, "so we shut off the lifeline." Around the table, nods. This wasn't revenge. It was strategy. Canada had long played the reliable partner, the quiet powerhouse of North American manufacturing, but years of rising tariffs, political snubs, and economic pressure had changed the calculus. The United States no longer negotiated, they dictated. And now, Canada had chosen to flex the one tool it knew the US couldn't live without: steel. The language of the embargo was surgical, limited to raw and semi-finished steel. Exemptions removed, export clearances revoked. Rail shipments halted at the border by 4 a.m. Carney signed it with a black pen, said nothing to press, and walked out. This wasn't about hurting America. It was about waking it up, about proving that even the strongest supply chains rest on foreign soil. And for once, Canada wasn't asking politely. It was issuing terms. The world took notice. European automakers began reviewing contracts. Asian manufacturers scrambled to secure secondary supply. The ripple wasn't economic. It was psychological. That opening move didn't just rattle Detroit. It sent tremors across the globe. Global factories go dark. The call came just before lunch. Ernesto Guzman, director of logistics at a Tier 2 steel parts supplier in Monterrey, Mexico, picked up his line expecting a routine update. Instead, the news was devastating. A key shipment of precision-milled steel from Canada was canceled mid-transit. No explanation, no alternative supplier, no timeline. Within 4 hours, Ernesto had to shut down his entire production line. "We build the subframes for US-bound SUVs," he explained. "You halt us, and 5 more factories halt with us." By nightfall, Ernesto's problem was not just his. It was Brazil's, it was Japan's, and it was soon to be Germany's. The supply chain collapse was not isolated. It was systemic. Canadian steel isn't merely traded, it's embedded, welded into contracts, optimized into lean systems. And now, with its flow severed, every country connected to North American assembly lines began to feel the squeeze. Toyota reported minor part delays in Nagoya. Volkswagen rerouted materials through South Korea. A parts cluster in Sao Paulo paused production, waiting for clarity that never came. This wasn't just a bilateral trade issue anymore. It was a global disruption with no center and no off switch. Steel had gone from abundant to scarce in a matter of days. The freeze wasn't finished. Canada still had sharp edges hidden in its next maneuver. Canada closes the trap. The embargo was never meant to be the end. Inside a leaked memo from the Canadian Trade Ministry, dated 4 days after the initial freeze, the real plan came into view. The embargo was Phase 1. Phase 2 was what officials called targeted economic compression. In plainer terms, hit the United States, where it cannot easily recover. The memo outlined a precision strategy to restrict a specific subset of steel products, niche industrial grades used in battery casing, aerospace tubing, and electric drivetrains. These weren't general materials. They were keystones, tiny specialized imports with no ready substitutes and long certification windows. Unlike a sweeping embargo, this was designed like a sniper shot. Any attempt to replace the components would trigger delays of weeks or months. Whole vehicle lines could be derailed over missing brackets. The United States didn't see it coming, at least not that fast. Supply managers scrambled to understand why shipments were being delisted from customs clearance systems. Small obscure part codes vanished from import queues. By the time US officials realized this was a second wave, the damage had already begun. Aerospace suppliers raised alarms. EV manufacturers reported strange gaps in fulfillment. And on Capitol Hill, whispers began that this wasn't retaliation anymore. It was strategic punishment. DC's patience shattered in minutes, and retaliation came like a wrecking ball. The tariff backfire. They called it a proportional response, but it wasn't. In a fiery press conference framed by American flags and economic charts, the U.S. Trade Representative announced a sweeping escalation, a new tariff slate that would hit Canadian metals with penalties as high as 50%. No carve-outs, no exceptions. The message was clear. If Canada wanted to play hardball, the United States would bring a sledgehammer. Markets reacted instantly. Canadian exports tumbled. But something strange happened on the American side. Prices rose, fast. Steel manufacturers who expected to benefit saw their stock dip instead. Why? Because they weren't ready to scale up. U.S. producers were already operating at capacity and now faced new compliance burdens, equipment shortages, and labor gaps. At Cleveland Cliffs, North America's largest flat-rolled steel supplier, Internal projections showed a net loss of nearly $300 million within one fiscal quarter, despite the tariff advantage. American automakers warned of further job cuts and slowed production. Home builders paused contracts as construction steel costs doubled. Even craft breweries reported delays in sourcing aluminum cans. In trying to punish Canada, the United States had accidentally inflicted pain across its own economy. Small manufacturers, who had no buffer or political leverage, were crushed first. A metal parts shop in Iowa laid off its entire second shift. An EV startup in California paused production, citing material unpredictability. Even gun manufacturers reported rising steel prices. Punishment was aimed at Canada, but it hit home first. While Washington swung wildly, others quietly rewrote the rules of the game. Foreign rivals feast. As North American supply chains buckled, foreign competitors moved with surgical precision. A confidential investor briefing out of Tokyo circulated just 6 days after Canada's export freeze, detailed Toyota's pivot strategy. Phase 1, reroute steel sourcing through Southeast Asia. Phase 2, shift export destinations from U.S. ports to European and Middle Eastern markets. Phase 3, scale up production in hybrid-friendly nations to bypass tariff volatility altogether. Hyundai executed a similar maneuver. German automakers, long wary of U.S. trade instability, fast-tracked plans to build a new electric vehicle line entirely outside of North America. The global industry was not collapsing, it was reshuffling. And in that reshuffle, the United States was losing ground. Foreign brands saw the trade war not as a crisis, but as a market opening. With U.S. firms distracted, prices ballooning, and government infighting at its peak, now was the time to claim territory. Volkswagen launched a new campaign across Asia, promising zero trade barriers, maximum delivery speed. In China, Nissan began offering discounts on exports to regions untouched by tariff chaos. The narrative was shifting fast. The United States wasn't seen as a dominant force anymore. It was unstable, risky, reactive. With corporate giants realigning, the people caught in the middle were about to feel the squeeze. No cars, no clarity. The lot was too quiet. No test drives, no revving engines, no shuffle of customers inspecting new sedans under the showroom lights. Marissa Daniels, a middle school teacher in Lexington, Kentucky, had been saving for almost 2 years to replace her 15-year-old Honda. But when she arrived to pick up the hybrid SUV she'd reserved, the manager just shook his head. "It's delayed," he said, voice low. "Could be 6 weeks, could be 6 months." Marissa wasn't alone. Across the United States, dealerships reported a collapse in inventory. Vehicles once stacked row by row now sat in sparse lines. Models that once took days to arrive now had indefinite wait times. Prices climbed fast. The average car price rose by nearly $4,000 in a week. Used car prices spiked even higher. Dealers couldn't negotiate. They had nothing to sell. Buyers were stunned. This wasn't a financial crash or a tech glitch. This was steel, vanished, and without it, there were no fenders, no frames, no deliveries. It was a strange kind of panic. Not loud or riotous, just quiet frustration spreading across suburbs and cities. Each delayed pickup and canceled lease another data point in a national breakdown. Local dealerships began leaving handwritten notes taped to locked doors. No new vehicles until further notice. Phone lines rang endlessly, with buyers demanding updates. In suburban Texas, a mother trying to replace her totaled minivan was told the wait could be 4 months. Minimum. Scarcity was no longer abstract. It was personal. Beyond the empty lots and missed deliveries, a louder voice was building momentum. Labor hits back. At a rally outside the shuttered GM plant in Lordstown, Ohio, United Auto Workers President Lisa Baines stepped onto a makeshift platform of pallets and crates. 100 flags waved in the wind behind her. She didn't hold back. "This wasn't just bad policy," she shouted into the mic. "It was betrayal from both sides of the border." The crowd roared. Baines pounded the podium. "We build the cars. We build the economy. And when the steel stopped, they left us hanging." UAW wasn't alone. Labor unions from Alabama to Illinois joined in coordinated protests, citing economic abandonment. Some blamed Canadian politics. Others pointed squarely at Washington. but the shared anger was undeniable. Chants erupted. No steel, no wheels. We bleed for the machine. Entire shifts showed up at rally points in uniforms, waving placards with VIN numbers of unfinished vehicles they never got to finish. What stung most wasn't the job loss. It was the silence. The fact that thousands of workers had to learn about their fate through rumor, text chains, or supervisor shrugs. No warning, no plan, just sudden stillness. The trade war, they said, had been waged by people who never touched the line, and now the line was gone. Their chants reached Capitol Hill, and the reaction? Explosive. Capitol in chaos. The House chamber was already tense when Representative Carla Jennings, a first-term Democrat from Michigan, held up a photo of a shuttered Chrysler plant. This, she declared, is what policy without planning looks like. Republican members immediately pushed back, shouting over her as C-SPAN cameras rolled. "Where was your administration when the tariffs hit?" someone barked. Jennings didn't flinch. "The tariffs were a match," she replied, "but Canada lit the fuse." The hearing devolved fast. Committee members exchanged accusations. One senator floated a full U.S. withdrawal from the USMCA agreement, arguing that North American unity is a fantasy if Canada weaponizes trade. Leaked emails between Department of Commerce officials revealed internal confusion over how to respond. Some staffers advised diplomatic back-channeling. Others wanted retaliatory sanctions not just on Canadian metals, but on consumer goods, timber, and even dairy. No consensus formed. Instead, the politics spiraled into identity warfare. Lawmakers used the chaos to score points on protectionism, populism, and economic sovereignty. There were no concrete resolutions, only headlines, viral clips, and mounting distrust between allies. Congressional hearings turned into finger-pointing free-for-alls. Lawmakers accused each other of weakness, short-sighted trade deals, and selling out American labor. One senator shouted, "This is what dependency gets us." Another countered, "You voted for it." Meanwhile, no legislation passed. Cameras rolled, but action stalled. Theater replaced policy, and the public noticed. While America turned inward, Canada prepared one final devastating blow. Detroit under siege. The embargo was extended, this time not on raw steel, but on finished U.S. automobiles entering the Canadian market. At precisely 8 o'clock Eastern, Canada's trade minister announced a 25% tariff on all passenger vehicles manufactured in the United States. This wasn't about raw material anymore. It was about finished goods, the very cars struggling to roll off half-complete assembly lines. The impact was swift and brutal. General Motors, Ford, and Stellantis had used Canada as a critical export hub. Now, their vehicles would cost thousands more north of the border, pricing them out of dealerships already bracing for consumer pullback. Parts suppliers along the I-75 corridor received cancellation notices within 48 hours. Plants in Ontario that handled final assembly for U.S. brands began rotating layoffs, and smaller Michigan machine shops, many family-owned, were hit with order freezes. This was not tit for tat. It was economic chess. Canada had shifted from cutting supply to blocking demand. Detroit wasn't just stuck, it was surrounded. For years, trade had been a quiet river flowing both ways. Now it had frozen solid. As auto giants braced for impact, entire industries began to see their own reflection in the wreckage. Steel starvation spreads. The headline stayed focused on Detroit, but the steel shockwave did not. Within 2 weeks of Canada's export freeze, price charts across industries painted a much darker picture. In Portland, a high-rise project was postponed indefinitely after rebar costs jumped by more than 40%. In Tulsa, aerospace suppliers raised quotes by nearly 20% due to high-tensile steel shortages. And in Austin, a major craft brewery halted its canning line. Aluminum supply had dried up, collateral damage in the widening trade retaliation. Steel wasn't just for cars, it was the spine of modern life. From the beams in apartment buildings to the tanks that stored drinking water, the supply web stretched everywhere, and now it was unraveling, quietly but steadily. Construction companies attempted substitutions, but alternatives like fiberglass or composite were either too costly or structurally unsuitable. Aerospace firms turned to overseas suppliers, incurring customs delays that rippled into delayed deliveries. Even packaging companies that produced canned goods began stockpiling what little material they had, triggering mini shortages in grocery chains from Pennsylvania to California. The dominoes fell fast. One sector froze, then 2, then 6. The shock was no longer isolated. It was architectural, aeronautical, agricultural. A Missouri farm equipment company halted production when their steel blade supplier missed a delivery. In Chicago, A skyscraper crew laid off 80 workers as beams sat undelivered. Across dozens of sectors, small business owners watched contracts fall apart. It wasn't just about missing steel, it was the sudden loss of certainty. From industrial collapse to cultural fracture, the fallout wasn't just economic anymore. Trade turns tribal. It started on Twitter, then TikTok. Videos from Hamilton, Ontario, showed workers replacing American flags outside steel plants with red maple leaves. The caption read, "We're not your warehouse anymore." Within hours, the clip went viral across Canadian social media, collecting over 4 million views. In Vancouver, bumper stickers reading, "Cut the cord," became a common sight. In Montreal, shoppers asked for locally made appliances, even if they cost more. A mood had shifted. The economic fracture between Canada and the United States had begun to calcify into something deeper: cultural disengagement. In response, American influencers pushed a new slogan, "Built here, bought here." TikTok compilations of American-made trucks with patriotic soundtracks surged in popularity. Reddit threads chronicled Canadian backstabbing. News segments debated whether Canada had ever truly been an ally at all. The trade war had metastasized into an identity war. Both governments tried to lower the rhetoric, but the grassroots narrative had already escaped containment. School kids debated tariffs in classrooms. Grandparents refused to buy cross-border products. Even regional TV ads featured subtle digs. Real steel, real America. What began as an economic scuffle now threatened to rewire public perception. Not just about trade, but about trust. But behind the hashtags and headlines, Wall Street was quietly bleeding out. Markets in meltdown. At 9:30 a.m. sharp, the bell rang on the New York Stock Exchange. But instead of a rally, there was a slide. Automotive stocks opened red and never recovered. By noon, Ford had dropped 6%. GM was down nearly 9%. Tesla, despite being insulated from North American steel, dipped 5% on investor panic alone. On a video call with pension fund managers, a representative from one of the largest retirement investment boards in the country used one word to describe the landscape: contagious. It was no longer just about production delays. It was about systemic risk, portfolio exposure to companies caught in the trade crossfire. Retirement accounts shrank. ETFs anchored in industrials and materials tanked. One index tracking U.S. auto and steel closed the week down 21%. The broader S&P showed strain, with volatility indexes peaking for the first time since early COVID-era trading. Middle-class investors felt the pressure. Savings accounts, 401ks, and college funds all took hits. For many, this wasn't abstract. It was immediate. One Detroit machinist said, "I lost hours this week and $4,000 in my retirement fund. That's not a policy debate. That's my future." The panic wasn't just financial, it was emotional and contagious. Analysts on Bloomberg whispered about a silent correction turning into a full-blown rout. Large institutions began offloading shares in anything steel adjacent: auto, appliances, infrastructure. Traders called it rot in the core. Even retirement advisors told clients to brace. The message was clear. This wasn't just volatility, it was exposure on a national scale. With trillions at risk, a bigger question emerged. Was this just the beginning of something irreversible? If this has you questioning where everything's headed, don't just wonder. Stay in the loop. Subscribe right now so you don't miss what we uncover next. This story's not over. In fact, the next move could change the game entirely. New drops are coming, fast, and when they do, you'll want to be first to know. Goodbye, globalization. 3 weeks after Canada froze steel exports, a policy white paper circulated through the inboxes of government staffers, think tank analysts, and multinational CEOs. Titled "End of Flow: Industrial Fragility and the Collapse of Just-in-Time," the document laid out a singular conclusion. The age of seamless supply chains was over. For 30 years, globalization had been gospel. Build where it's cheap, ship where it's needed, profit everywhere. But now, national security, political retaliation, and logistics instability had converged into a new era, one where resilience mattered more than efficiency. The white paper advocated for reshoring critical industries, expanding domestic raw material access, and moving toward what it called strategic redundancy, the deliberate duplication of production systems to avoid single points of failure. Governments began to respond, quietly, then openly. France floated a bill to localize battery manufacturing. Japan invested in alternative steel alloys sourced domestically. In the United States, lawmakers from both parties began crafting proposals to fund federal steel stockpiles and incentivize industrial redundancy. EV roadmaps were re-examined. Aerospace timelines were redrawn. Tech giants governments started mapping their material dependencies with national origin tags. Because what happened in the Steel War wasn't a hiccup, it was a preview. Because whoever adapts to this new reality won't just survive, they'll control it. This wasn't just a trade war, it was a warning. And if you've made it this far, you already see how deep it goes. Don't stop here. Subscribe now so you don't miss what's coming next, because the fallout is still spreading, and the stories being buried are the ones that matter most. Drop a comment with your take. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, what they call business as usual is anything but. Stay sharp.